Hello and welcome back to Rage Gaming once again in a new Elden Ring build. Today I'm finally talking about the insane body buff, that being Last Rites. It's a simple concept where we apply a buff to ourselves and then that increases the damage we deal in general. But it also massively increases the damage you can deal specifically to those that live in death, aka skeletons, undead, or the Deathbird bosses and so on. Previously this was just fine. Now in 1.07 this is insane. It really seems like they've overbuffed it because I'm hitting like 5,000 to 7,000 per attack with a proper weapon, meaning I am three-shotting endgame bosses. If we scale this massively back and use a +0 rapier and put on the buff, it is almost tripling the damage against those that live in undeath. As a buff, this patch, it increases your attack power. It lasts way longer and it'll triple your damage against those that live in death. And best of all, it's a body buff. What that means is I can apply this buff, right? Now I have the benefits. You can see the sword on the icon under my bars there. And I can completely unequip the weapon. And I still have the buff. I'm still benefiting from the extra damage, the triple damage against those that live in undeath. And I've got improved AR as well. That fact could be huge in the DLC with potential new enemies who are undead, especially boss fights, where knowing this and using this where relevant will make those fights just a joke. Of course, this isn't the only aspect of this build. We can use other great weapons that have been buffed in this patch that I've wanted to talk about, such as the Inseparable sword and the Miquellan Knight Sword. Both of these are incredible. One makes use of the new improved two-hand greatsword playstyle, and the other is the hilariously strong Power Stand Straight Swords, which has the same Ash of War with the same benefits and the same perks, making for a varied build with one core. Let's talk about this build and how it works in PvP. This build all starts with Last Rites, where we're going to buff ourselves up and give ourselves over a 10% damage increase, even against those that are completely not relevant to those that live in death. So that applies in PvP, of course. What could we work a holy build with? Well, there are two weapons that we like to see, which we just talked about, the Inseparable sword and the Miquellan Knight Sword. When it comes to the Inseparable sword, this is a really cool great sword. Not just in design, but the way it works. It has a fairly unique moveset, which feels very vertical, reminding me of the Guardian sword spears, which are incredible for fast rolling punishment, where you constantly do the attack and an enemy rolling around you, they're going to struggle, run out of stamina and get hit eventually. It's a great roll punisher, but it's also a trading machine because of that. Very quickly, people seem to pick up the strange attack motions, get the timing, and then you could just throw in a heavy attack, which looks nigh on the same, but then it's obviously slower, and then follow it up with lights, which come out much faster, surprising them when they think you're vulnerable now. The damage of each hit is going to be staggeringly effective, especially when buffed up with the Ash of War, Sacred Blade, which was buffed this patch. The damage of this Ash will hit like a truck at melee range because you will hit with the blade and the holy effect itself, leading to roughly 1,000 damage or upwards in PvP, which is certainly something you don't want to be hit by. At range, you're going to get maybe 500, maybe even 600, which is nothing to ignore either, as you can send this out when someone's trying to do something at range, like casting an incantation or spell, and you interrupt them because it comes out quick. But back on point, the base hits are very impressive, especially when buffed up. For a relatively fast moveset with this, with impressive range thanks to the pretty long range or length of the greatsword. Sometimes I'd land an attack and I'd be surprised that I actually did. The buff itself lasts a nice long while now, so it's not something you need to overly worry about maintaining. You can just use it once and enjoy the extra holy AR if you're not relying on the ranged attack, which I mean, you should be. So overall, I really like the Inseparable sword and its mechanics, from the design to the gameplay. It is great. But we do have another option to switch things up. Power Stancing Straight Swords using that Miquellan Knight Sword. It's the same concept with a different moveset. We have the Knight Sword here, which allows us to power stance the Straight Sword moveset, which is great, super fast, leading to high DPS potential if you can get those hits off. Naturally, with our heavier armor and Bull Goat's Talisman I'm running, we have a good amount of poise to trade with. But what's really cool here is the fact that the sword has the same Ash of War, Sacred Blade, which again was buffed in the same way. We have a lengthy holy damage buff, which features the same swipe and ranged attack animation we had before. So it has all the same perks. The downside is the lower AR on these types of weapons compared to the greatsword, so the Ash hit itself will deal less damage, but to make up for it, you have much faster attacks and therefore much higher DPS. If you can trade on multi-hit combo someone, especially when buffed up, the output's going to be crazy. When you're dealing like 300 to 400 damage a hit and you're landing 4 blows or more in each trade, Obviously that's a lot of damage. And you have the perk of the range pressure of the Ash, interrupting people where possible, or trading at close range. The best part of this though, is if you're dealing with someone who is maybe hard to deal with your straight swords due to the range or the moveset, you can just swap to the greatsword. A totally different moveset, but with the same Ash benefits to really mess with someone who maybe is used to the moveset you have, the weapons, and now suddenly what they were doing isn't working anymore. I found that actually really useful. Where I might have to rely on incantations or other things in that kind of situation, I can just swap weapon, no problem. It's a fun concept, but most importantly, I think it's an effective one, so I've really enjoyed using it in PvP. On the other hand, we have PvE. What can I say about this build? It's obviously insane against any enemy that's remotely weak to Holy, but still effective against those that are resistant to it. The output's impressive, and you're gonna face plenty of mega weak to Holy enemies, especially those that live in death. I will admit that the probably most resistant stat in the game is sadly Holy due to the nature of the lore and the setting in the final fights, but that doesn't mean this is useless or weak. You can see in an average boss fight my output is great, and whether you're using the greatsword for its higher AR and rage damage with the Ash, or smashing a boss with loads of successive buffed up hits with the straight swords, you're gonna be strong as hell. You can pick and choose depending on the enemy, whether you've got longer punish windows so you can get successive attacks off, therefore go for the straight swords, or if the smaller punish windows, you want the heavier hitting greatsword. Ultimately, before you do anything, you can buff up with the various buffs, incantations, and of course, last rites. And the moment you face any enemy that lives in death, the damage is gonna be staggering. For the video, I was testing how much damage it actually increases against these skeletons. I wasn't expecting it to be that strong. It's stupid. I feel like they overtuned it, especially when I try my actual weapon while having that buff. 5,000 to 7,000 to hit is ridiculous. For a weapon that's quick, it makes no sense. One-shotting most deathbirds in the game with that kind of damage. At late game, against the massive health pool one, 3 hits. If there are any undead enemies or bosses in the DLC, you want to be using this buff. You're messing up if you don't. The fact that it's a body buff, there's no excuse. You can equip the weapon, pop a talisman to get the stats you need, which you might not even need to do because the stat requirements are so low. Take the weapon off, go back to your normal build, and you're good to go. Like, they increased how long that buff lasts as well. Either way, this is going to be a super fun setup in PvE and PvP, especially against those that live in death. But now it's time for us to talk about the build because, yeah, there's multiple weapons. There's a lot going on here. Let's explain it and talk about what options you have if you want to alter this build or work this weapon in somehow. So the weapon that we care about is the golden Epitaph. That's what has last rites on it. That's how we're getting that body buff, and that's basically all you need to know. The greatsword we were using in two-hand is the Inseparable sword. I love this weapon, obviously, after talking about it. This one has a highest scaling stat, it's faith. So you actually benefit from maxing your faith more than anything, which can't be said about the poorly scaled Miquellan Knight sword, sadly, as it's D in all. But thanks to its output and fast moveset, it's still great. Erdtree's Seal is great because it weighs nothing and just scales with faith, but I don't even need to upgrade this because I'm not using any offensive incantations, just buffs. The armor is not that important. I'm using the Haligtree helm because it's a helmet that gives you 1 extra faith when you've got it equipped, so I can save 1 level using it. And the rest is purely cosmetic, although wearing heavier armor like the twin set is good because of the poise it offers. Our talismans for PvP, we have Shard of Alexander for improving the Ash of War damage. We have Carrion Filigree Crest, so we can spam out our Ashes of War at less cost. For PvP specifically though, it's the Bull Goat's Talisman for the extra poise. And lastly, we have Erdtree's Favor for the benefits of the health, stamina, equip load. If we were running a PvE version of this build, I would drop the Bull Goats and of course equip the Sacred Scorpion Charm to further improve our holy damage. With the Flask of Wondrous Physic, we obviously want the Holy Shrouding Cracked Tear to improve our holy damage, the basis of this build. Depends what you're doing otherwise. For PvP, I like the Crimson Bubble Tear because in duels sometimes people pop that and I want to have it if they do. But in PvE, I definitely recommend the Thorny Cracked Tear for the consecutive hits, especially with the Power Stance straight swords because you're going to be hitting very quickly and that's going to be great. Ultimately, you could focus on one thing, say only power stancing straight swords, and then you have incantations that you're using. Or you could not use the straight swords, just use the buff of Golden Epitaph and main the Inseparable sword. And again, you'd have more room in your build there to work in some incantations. For the stats though, we are maximizing what we have. So we've got the max 60 vigor we want, 17 mind because we've got the Carrion Filigree Crest, we can get away with that. 21 endurance for the armor we're wearing, just barely reaching that medium load. The minimal stats for strength and dex, and then we've got 80 faith. So again, this build will work well with some high faith incantations if you wanted to work that in. But there you have it. That is the build in full and in both sides of the content. I'm really happy with this. I'm really enjoying using it. But the main takeaway for me is, yeah, the absolutely insane power of Last Rites in this patch. I feel like not enough people are aware of this or talking about it. It's ridiculous that this is a body buff that triples your damage against those that are living on death, which there are many enemies in this game that are like that. And then that buff stays when you want to equip it. It's arguably one of the most important weapons of the game to have and use the moment you come across an enemy that is weak to that type of damage. There really is no downside and not a good reason not to do it. And in the DLC, if they're going to give us any of those types of enemies, you need to know about this and you got to be using it. It's so strong, that tripling of damage, that I am like convinced once they realize, like maybe later in the DLC when they see people doing this, that they need to nerf it. But for now, why not take advantage of it? If you guys enjoy these build videos, then let me know with a like on the video so I can keep making them. And if you have any build suggestions, then you can also drop that in the comments. For now though, I've been Hollow, you've been you, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.